Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. Diane Jenkins stumbled upon that night was the kind that could rot dynasties from the inside out. It began quietly, almost cruelly so, with Diane standing in the shadowed corridor outside Jack Abbott's private study at the Abbott mansion, her heart already uneasy because instinct had taught her long ago that when Jack closed doors and lowered his voice, something dangerous was being protected. She had meant to eavesdrop. She told herself that even as she lingered, one hand resting against the cool wood of the door, listening to Jack's voice, tight, controlled, laced with an emotion he rarely let anyone hear anymore. Nikki Newman's voice answered him, low and shaking, and the sound of it sent a ripple of dread through Diane because Nikki didn't come to the Abbott mansion after midnight unless the past had clawed its way back into the present. Diane's breath caught when she realized this wasn't about business, or even about Victor. This was raw, intimate, and steeped in a history that should have stayed buried. Jack accused Nikki of lying to him for decades, of letting him believe a version of events that had shaped his marriage, his divorces, his bitterness, and Nikki fired back that Jack had begged her to keep quiet, that he had been drunk, reckless, terrified of destroying both the Abbotts and the Newmans in one catastrophic confession. Diane's blood ran cold as the truth spilled out in fragments. One night years ago, a hotel room during a business war, too much alcohol, too much vulnerability, and a consequence that had been quietly erased with money, influence, and a lie so big it had rewritten history. Diane's hand flew to her mouth when Nikki hissed the words that shattered everything, that a child had been conceived, that Victor never knew because Jack had sworn Nikki to secrecy, and that the child had been taken away, hidden, adopted under a false name to protect empires that had no right to survive at that cost. The world tilted for Diane. Her knees weakened as she realized she was listening to something obscene not because it was sexual, but because it was cruel, because two of Genoa City's moral pillars had decided, together, that a life was disposable if it preserved their reputations. Her thoughts raced to Kyle, to the way Jack had always fought for family, to the sanctimonious speeches Nikki had delivered about loyalty and truth, and rage burned so hot it made her dizzy. She stepped back too fast, her heels scraping softly against the floor, and the voices inside the room stopped mid-sentence. The door yanked open and Jack froze when he saw Diane standing there, her face drained of color, eyes blazing with shock and betrayal, and for a heartbeat none of them spoke, because they all knew the damage had already been done. Nikki moved first, rushing toward Diane, pleading, insisting she'd misunderstood, that nothing was as simple as it sounded, but Diane laughed, a sharp, broken sound, and told them the truth didn't need polishing when it was already filthy. Jack tried to reach her, tried to explain, tried to frame it as a mistake made in fear, but Diane backed away, shaking her head, telling him that fear didn't excuse stealing someone's future, didn't excuse lying to everyone who had ever trusted him. She turned to leave, desperate for air, desperate to think, but Nikki's panic exploded into something reckless as she grabbed Diane's arm and begged her not to say anything, warning her that Victor could never know, that the fallout would destroy lives, and Diane snapped back that maybe destruction was exactly what secrets like this deserved. The argument spiraled, voices rising, years of resentment detonating all at once, until Diane wrenched herself free and ran, straight into the darkened foyer where a figure stepped out of the shadows and everything changed. It was Jeremy Stark, his eyes cold, his smile predatory. The ghost of Diane's past come back to collect, and the moment he spoke her name, Diane understood that fate had chosen the worst possible night to intersect all her sins. Jeremy had heard enough, he said softly, enough to make himself very valuable, and when Jack demanded he leave, Jeremy laughed and produced a gun from his jacket, turning the room into a frozen nightmare. Nikki screamed. Jack stepped protectively in front of her without thinking, and Jeremy's grin widened because leverage was his favorite drug. He told Diane that she owed him, that she always would, and that now she had something even better than money. She had a secret that could bring the Newmans and Abbotts to their knees. Diane felt trapped between the past she'd survived and the truth she couldn't unhear, her mind racing as Jeremy advanced, the gun swinging lazily from Jack to Nikki to her. He demanded Diane come with him, demanded Jack and Nikki stay silent forever, and when Jack refused, when he swore he would call the police and expose everything if Jeremy didn't leave, Jeremy fired a warning shot into the ceiling, plaster raining down like ash. The sound jolted Diane into action, survival instincts honed by years of running and reinventing herself, screaming that this moment would define who she was allowed to be next. She saw Jack lunge, saw Nikki stumble, saw Jeremy's finger tighten, and before she could think, Diane grabbed the fallen gun Jack had knocked loose in the chaos, her hands shaking so violently she thought she might drop it. She screamed for Jeremy to stop, to leave, to put his weapon down, but he only laughed, daring her, telling her she didn't have it in her, telling her she was still the same frightened woman who always needed someone else to save her. The insult cut deeper than any threat, and in that split second Diane realized this wasn't just about protecting Jack or Nikki or even herself. It was about refusing to be owned by her past ever again. When Jeremy raised his gun toward Jack, time fractured, sound vanished, and Diane pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the mansion like a scream ripped from its foundations, and Jeremy fell backward, blood blooming across his shirt as he collapsed to the floor. Nikki sobbed, Jack stared at Diane in horror and awe, and Diane stood there, gun still raised, unable to process what she'd done, the weight of it crashing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. Sirens wailed in the distance as reality rushed back in, and Diane dropped the gun, her knees giving out as Jack caught her, his arms tight around her, whispering that she'd saved them, that everything would be okay, but Diane knew better. Nothing would ever be okay again. The police arrived, questions flew, statements were taken, and Diane told the truth about Jeremy, about the threat, about why she'd fired, but she said nothing about what she'd overheard before the nightmare erupted, because some truths, once spoken, could never be put back in their cages. Nikki avoided Diane's eyes, guilt etched into every line of her face, while Jack tried desperately to read Diane's expression, to understand whether she would protect him or destroy him with what she now knew. In the days that followed, the shooting dominated headlines, painting Diane as either a hero or a criminal depending on who was talking, while beneath the surface, the real bomb ticked louder with every passing hour. Diane replayed the conversation she'd overheard again and again, the implications unraveling her trust in Jack piece by piece, until love and revulsion existed side by side in her chest. She confronted Jack privately, demanding the full truth, demanding to know how he could live with himself, and Jack finally broke, confessing everything, admitting his cowardice, his fear of Victor, his terror of losing everything he'd built, and Diane listened with tears streaming down her face because understanding didn't equal forgiveness. Nikki tried too, cornering Diane at society, begging her to keep quiet, insisting that revealing the truth would destroy her children, her marriage, her entire life, and Diane replied calmly that maybe the lie had already done that, it just hadn't caught up yet. Victor sensed the shift immediately. Secrets had a smell, and this one was ripe, and when he began circling, asking questions, applying pressure, Diane knew she was standing at the edge of a cliff that would redefine Genoa City forever. She had fired a gun to save lives, but now she held something even more lethal than a weapon. The truth, ugly and inconvenient, and powerful enough to burn everything it touched. As she stood alone one night, staring out at the city lights, Diane understood that the real choice wasn't whether to expose Jack and Nikki, it was whether she could live with herself if she didn't, because some secrets weren't just disgusting, they were unforgivable, and sooner or later, they demanded their reckoning. The reckoning Diane had tried to postpone arrived the way it always did in Genoa City, quietly at first, disguised as routine, before detonating without mercy. In the days after the shooting, the Abbott mansion became a strange museum of trauma, its polished surfaces reflecting a version of reality no one wanted to claim. Jack moved through the house like a man split in two, publicly grateful, endlessly repeating that Diane had saved his life, privately haunted by the knowledge that the woman he loved now carried a truth that could annihilate him. Diane watched him carefully, noticing the way his hand shook when he poured coffee, The way his eyes lingered on her just a beat too long, as if he were trying to memorize her before she disappeared from his life forever. She wasn't sure whether his fear hurt more than his lie. Nikki, meanwhile, unraveled in silence. She returned to the Newman ranch and threw herself into appearances, charity meetings, family dinners, forced smiles. Yet every night she woke gasping, convinced she could still hear the gunshot echoing through Jack's study, convinced that Diane's finger on that trigger had also been poised over her entire existence. Victor noticed, of course, he always did. He watched Nikki with narrowed eyes, cataloging inconsistencies, filing away the way she flinched whenever Jack's name surfaced, the way she drank just a little too much wine, and then abruptly stopped, as if afraid of what she might confess if she let herself go too far. Victor didn't need proof yet. Instinct told him something poisonous was circulating, and that alone was enough to make him dangerous. Kyle sensed it too, though he couldn't name it. He tried to be there for Diane, thanking her again and again for protecting his father, calling her brave, calling her his family, and every time he did, Diane felt something fracture inside her, because she wondered how long she could accept that gratitude without betraying him by omission. She began sleeping poorly, haunted by a recurring image of a faceless child, Jack's child, Nikki's child, standing alone at the edge of a road, waiting for parents who had chosen power over responsibility. The image followed her everywhere, turning society's laughter into static, turning whispered conversations into accusations. When Phyllis returned to town and immediately sensed tension radiating off the Abbotts like heat from a live wire, Diane knew it was only a matter of time before the truth found another path to daylight. Phyllis asked questions no one else dared to ask, her curiosity sharpened by jealousy and suspicion, and while Diane deflected, she could feel the walls closing in, each lie she told on Jack's behalf stacking higher until the structure threatened to collapse under its own weight. The pressure intensified when Chance reopened the investigation, not into the shooting, which had been ruled self-defense, but into Jeremy Stark's movements before that night. He'd been talking to someone, Chance revealed casually, someone who had fed him information about the Abbotts and the Newmans, and when Chance mentioned a burner phone traced to a shell account tied to Newman Enterprises, Nikki nearly dropped her glass. Diane watched the color drain from Nikki's face and knew, with sick certainty, that the past was no longer content to stay buried. That night, Jack finally broke. He came to Diane's room, eyes red, voice shaking, and begged her to help him fix this, to keep Nikki's secret just a little longer until he could figure out how to control the damage. Diane listened, arms folded tightly around herself, and asked him the question he'd been avoiding since she overheard that conversation. What happened to the child? Jack's silence was answer enough. He admitted he'd never looked, never asked, never wanted to know where the baby ended up, because knowing would have made the lie impossible to live with. Diane recoiled as if struck, telling him that ignorance wasn't absolution, that choosing not to know was still a choice, and Jack collapsed into a chair, sobbing, finally admitting that every moral speech he'd ever given rang hollow now. Diane left him there, unable to comfort him, realizing that love didn't mean protecting someone from the consequences of their worst decisions. The next morning, Victor made his move. He invited Diane to the ranch under the guise of thanking her personally for saving Nikki's life, but the moment she stepped inside his study, she knew she was prey. Victor didn't raise his voice. He never had to. He spoke calmly, praising her courage, then pivoted seamlessly into questions. Why Nikki had been at the Abbott mansion so late, why Jack seemed suddenly desperate, why Jeremy Stark had believed he possessed information valuable enough to risk his life. Diane tried to deflect, but Victor watched her like a chessboard, noting every hesitation, every breath taken too slowly, and finally he leaned forward and said the words that chilled her to the bone. Whatever you heard that night, Diane, understand this. Secrets don't protect people. They own them. Diane realized then that Victor didn't know the truth yet, but he was circling it, and if she stayed silent, she would become complicit in Nikki's betrayal of him. That realization cracked something open inside her. Later that day, Nikki confronted Diane in the park, desperation bleeding through her composure. She confessed more than she intended, admitting she'd paid people off, destroyed records, rewritten history so thoroughly she'd almost believed her own version, and she begged Diane, pleaded, really, not to take everything from her now. Diane listened, tears streaming down her face, and told Nikki the cruelest truth of all, that the secret had already taken everything, it just hadn't collected its final payment yet. Nikki's face hardened then, fear morphing into resolve, and she warned Diane that if she spoke, Victor would retaliate in ways Diane couldn't imagine. Diane replied softly that she'd already imagined worse, and survived it. The dominoes fell faster after that. Phyllis uncovered fragments of the story through her own relentless digging, enough to realize Jack was hiding something monumental, and when she confronted him publicly at the GCAC, his reaction confirmed everything she suspected. Ashley sensed blood in the water and demanded answers as well, furious that Jack had once again jeopardized the Abbott legacy with a secret born of arrogance and cowardice. The family fractured along invisible fault lines, loyalty clashing with outrage, while Diane stood at the center of it all, the reluctant keeper of a truth that refused to stay quiet. The final breaking point came when Kyle found Diane alone, packing a small bag. He asked her if she was leaving, if the pressure had become too much, and Diane finally looked at him, really looked at him, and understood that silence would destroy him just as surely as the truth might. She told him everything. Kyle's shock turned to disbelief, then to anger so fierce it scared them both. He demanded Jack's confirmation, and when Jack couldn't deny it, Kyle walked out, telling his father he didn't know who he was anymore. That was the moment Diane knew there was no turning back. Victor learned the truth within hours, and the explosion was nuclear. He confronted Nikki with a cold fury she hadn't seen in decades, not shouting, not raging, but dissecting her betrayal with surgical precision, informing her that the lie she'd told to protect him had actually robbed him of a child, of a life he never had the chance to fight for. Nikki collapsed, sobbing, while Victor stood unmoved, already calculating the fallout. By morning, Genoa City was buzzing with rumors, half-truths, and speculation, the scandals spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Diane watched the chaos unfold with a strange sense of calm, knowing she had crossed a line she could never uncross, but also knowing she had finally chosen honesty over fear. She had fired a gun to save lives, but it was the truth that would ultimately change them all. As the city reeled, one question lingered above the wreckage like smoke after a fire. Where was the child Jack and Nikki had erased, and what would happen when they learned the truth about who they really were? In Genoa City, lost children always found their way home eventually, and when this one did, the devastation would make everything that came before look like a warning shot. The city didn't sleep after the truth broke. It vibrated. Genoa City thrummed with whispered alliances, slammed doors, and hurried phone calls made in the dead of night, each one carrying a version of the same question: who would survive what Jack and Nikki had done? Diane felt the shift immediately. Strangers stared a little longer, friends spoke more carefully, and enemies smiled with a patience that promised future destruction. She had crossed from witness to catalyst, and there was no refuge left in neutrality. At the Abbott mansion, Jack sat alone in his study, staring at the empty space where the gunshot had scarred the ceiling, finally understanding that the lie he'd built his life around had ended everything it touched. He tried calling Kyle again and again, but the silence on the other end felt louder than any accusation. Nikki retreated into herself, refusing interviews, canceling appearances, her carefully curated image unraveling as Victor took control of every narrative he could still bend. Yet even Victor, master of damage control, couldn't fully contain the moral disgust spreading through the city, because this wasn't a hostile takeover or a business betrayal, it was a stolen child, and Genoa City knew the difference. Diane became an unlikely point of gravity, summoned by Ashley, confronted by Phyllis, questioned by Chance, each interaction reinforcing the same brutal truth, telling the truth hadn't ended the chaos, it had merely legitimized it. Chance asked whether Diane had known earlier, whether she'd hesitated, and Diane admitted she had, that fear and love had almost won, and Chance nodded, not absolving her, but acknowledging the human cost of impossible choices. Phyllis, sharper than ever, accused Diane of enjoying her role as moral arbiter, of relishing the power she now wielded over Jack's fate, and Diane shot back that Phyllis of all people should understand the weight of secrets kept too long. Their argument ended not with victory, but with mutual exhaustion. Two women too aware of their own histories to pretend righteousness came without scars. Meanwhile, Victor initiated a search, not through police channels, but through the shadow network he trusted more, tracing adoption records, financial